Mike Tyson was no stranger to controversy. He had endured scandals, battled relentless media scrutiny, and rebuilt his life when the world had counted him out. But this was different. It all started with a headline. Then another. Then a flood of news reports accusing Mike Tyson of assaulting a man at a luxury hotel bar. The allegations spread like wildfire, turning an ordinary night into a sensationalized scandal. Former heavyweight champion involved in late-night altercation. Mike Tyson attacks innocent man in heated confrontation. The headlines were everywhere, but there was just one problem: it never happened. Mike woke up to his phone buzzing non-stop. His team had already called 3 times, and his lawyer's number flashed repeatedly on the screen. Just as he was trying to make sense of it all, a knock at his hotel door made him pause. When he opened it, 2 police officers stood there, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Tyson, we need to talk." And just like that, Mike realized, this wasn't just another false story. Someone was setting him up. Mike Tyson had woken up to a morning like any other, until his phone started buzzing non-stop. First, one call. Then another. Then a flood of notifications, headlines flashing across the screen, each one worse than the last. Mike Tyson caught in bar fight, allegedly attacked innocent man. Tyson loses control again. Former boxer accused of late-night assault. Mike frowned, his fingers swiping through article after article, the words painting a picture that never even happened. He had been at the hotel bar, sure, but he hadn't attacked anyone. He had barely spoken to anyone besides the bartender. And now, the world was already calling him guilty. And just as he was trying to process it, a knock at the door made him look up. Boom. 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 Heavy. Firm. The kind of knock that told him whoever was on the other side wasn't delivering good news. When he opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood there, their expressions unreadable, their hands resting just a little too close to their belts. "Mr. Tyson, we need to talk." And just like that, Mike realized, this wasn't just a rumor anymore. Someone wanted him taken down. The morning had started like any other, until the knock at the hotel room door shattered the silence like a judge slamming a gavel down on a case that had already been decided before the defendant even stepped into the courtroom. It wasn't the kind of knock that came from room service, soft and polite, or even the kind that came from a fan hoping for an autograph. No, this was different. This was authoritative. This was deliberate. This was the kind of knock that carried weight, the kind of knock that told Mike before he even opened the door that whoever was standing on the other side wasn't here to have a conversation, they were here to make a decision. And that was when he knew something was wrong. Mike pulled open the door to find 2 uniformed officers standing in front of him, their expressions unreadable, their presence heavy. The taller one, broad-shouldered and stiff-jawed, had the look of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, walked into a situation already convinced he was right, already convinced the person standing in front of him was guilty, already convinced the story he had been told was the only one that mattered. The shorter officer, younger, less rigid, shifted slightly, glancing at his partner like he was waiting for a cue, like he wasn't entirely sure how to handle standing face-to-face with Mike Tyson, a man whose name alone carried more weight than any badge ever could. The taller officer didn't waste time. "Mr. Tyson, we need to talk." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was a statement. And the way he said it made it clear that whatever they were about to accuse him of, they already believed it. Mike exhaled, slow and steady, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides, not because he was nervous, not because he was afraid, but because he had been here before, not in this exact situation, not in this exact hotel, but in a moment where his name was already guilty before the facts even had a chance to be spoken. The officer squared his shoulders, flipping open a small notepad, as if he was just following routine, as if this was just another case instead of a situation that could alter the trajectory of a man's life in an instant. "We received multiple witness statements placing you at the scene of an altercation last night," he said, voice cold, measured, carrying the weight of someone who wasn't interested in what Mike had to say, just interested in confirming what he already believed. "The victim has filed charges. You're being accused of assault." Mike's jaw tightened. Not because he was guilty, but because he knew how this worked. And the way this officer was looking at him made it clear that his words weren't going to matter. "What victim?" Mike asked, his voice calm but firm, because if they were going to play this game, if they were going to stand here and act like they had the right to accuse him without proof, they were at least going to have to say the name of the man who was trying to take him down. The officer barely hesitated before flipping another page in his notebook. "A man named Evan Chambers claims you struck him in an unprovoked attack outside the bar around midnight." Mike blinked. Who? Because that name meant absolutely nothing to him. The second officer, the younger one who still hadn't spoken, shifted slightly, his weight moving from one foot to the other, as if even he wasn't fully convinced of what they were saying. Mike kept his eyes locked on them, studying them the way he used to study his opponents before a fight, looking for weaknesses, looking for cracks, looking for the one moment that would tell him everything he needed to know. And then he saw it. The flicker. The hesitation. The way the younger officer looked like he wanted to ask a question but was afraid to, like even he knew this wasn't adding up. Because if Mike Tyson had hit someone, there wouldn't be any confusion about it. Mike exhaled again, slower this time, shaking his head as he crossed his arms over his chest. "You really think I'd be dumb enough to throw a punch in a hotel full of cameras?" And that was when he saw it, the moment the younger officer's doubt grew stronger, the way his partner barely hesitated before answering, the way it suddenly became very clear that they hadn't even checked the footage before coming here. Because if they had, they wouldn't be standing here. They would already know that this was a setup. The taller officer, the one leading the charge, wasn't fazed, at least, not on the outside. "Mr. Tyson, if you want to come down to the station voluntarily, it'll be easier then." Mike cut him off. Easier for who? Because it sure as hell wasn't going to be easier for him. Before the officers could say another word, Mike's lawyer walked into the room, calm, collected, and ready for war. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, "I assume you have footage of this so-called attack." Silence. The taller officer's jaw tightened. And that? That was the moment Mike knew they had nothing. It didn't take long for the security footage to be pulled. And when the officers finally saw it, the room went dead silent. There was Mike, sitting at the bar. There was Evan Chambers, drunk, stumbling, barely able to walk straight. And then there was Evan tripping over his own damn feet, hitting the floor, staying down for a few seconds before looking around to see if anyone had noticed. And when he realized no one had, he looked in Mike's direction. And smiled. Because he knew exactly what he was about to do. Mike leaned forward, watching the footage with them, his lips curling into a smirk as he shook his head. "So, y'all still want to take me in, or we done here?" The younger officer looked away. The older officer exhaled sharply, closing his notebook, looking anywhere but at Mike. And that? That was the moment Mike Tyson knew they had just lost the fight before it even started. Because the truth had already knocked them out. By the time Mike Tyson arrived at the police station, his name was already everywhere. The media had worked fast, faster than the truth, faster than the investigation, faster than the very people whose job it was to figure out what had actually happened. News outlets had blasted out the accusation like it was a fact, turning speculation into scandal, making sure that when the public saw his name, it wasn't connected to his legacy, his discipline, or his redemption, it was connected to the one thing they always wanted to believe about him. Mike Tyson arrested for bar fight. Former heavyweight champ loses control again. Sources say victim feared for his life. Mike scrolled through the headlines on his phone, his jaw tightening, his grip on the screen so tight it nearly cracked. He had been accused before. He had been judged before. But this? This wasn't just about what happened that night. This was about how fast people wanted to believe the worst about him. And that was the real fight. By the time the police car pulled up to the station, the scene outside looked less like law enforcement doing their job and more like a full-blown media circus. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, their bright bursts cutting through the morning light like gunfire. Microphones were shoved forward, voices overlapping in a chaotic mess of half-formed questions, each one aimed at trapping him, at forcing a reaction, at making him look guilty before he had even spoken a word. "Mike, did you really hit the man? Is this another violent outburst? Do you regret your actions?" Mike didn't answer. Didn't slow down. Didn't even let them see a flicker of emotion. Because that's what they wanted. They wanted him angry. They wanted him unstable. They wanted the version of him they had already decided existed. And the best thing he could do? Not give them a damn thing. Inside the police station, the flashing lights and shouting voices were left behind, but the weight of the accusation still pressed down on him, thick and heavy, like the air before a fight, like the moment before a bell rang in the ring, like the split second before an opponent lunged. Mike was led into a cold, windowless room, a simple metal table in front of him, a single chair waiting like it was part of some ritual meant to strip him of his power. He didn't sit. Didn't need to. Because he wasn't about to make himself comfortable in a place that had already decided he belonged. The officer in charge, a man with a tired face and an unimpressed stare, walked in, dropped a thick stack of papers onto the table, and crossed his arms. "The victim claims you hit him so hard he blacked out," the detective said, his voice void of any real curiosity, like he wasn't here to find the truth, just to go through the motions of pretending he cared. Mike smirked. "That's funny," he said, tilting his head slightly. "'Cause if I hit him, he wouldn't just black out, he'd still be on the ground." Silence. The officer didn't react. Didn't even blink. Because they weren't here for the truth. They were here for a confession that wasn't coming. The detective slid a stack of statements across the table. Mike glanced at them, his eyes scanning the names, 3 people he had never even spoken to, let alone seen, all claiming they witnessed something that never happened. Fake witnesses. False reports. Fabricated details. It was so damn obvious. "So let me get this straight," Mike said, his voice calm but edged with something sharp, something dangerous. 3 people I've never met are saying I hit a guy I've never talked to, in a bar filled with cameras, and y'all didn't think to check the footage before bringing me in?" The detective didn't answer. And that was all the answer Mike needed. While the officers wasted their time on witness statements that meant nothing, Mike's lawyer was already 10 steps ahead, demanding the hotel security footage, pushing for the one thing that would shut this whole thing down before it could go any further. Mike didn't need to fight this battle with his fists. He just needed the truth to be seen. And when the footage finally arrived, it took less than a minute for everything to fall apart. The screen flickered on, and there it was. Mike, sitting at the bar, alone, sipping his drink, not even acknowledging the man who had accused him. Then there was Evan Chambers, drunk, stumbling, barely able to stand on his own. And then, the moment that changed everything. Evan didn't get punched. Didn't get shoved. Didn't even get touched. He tripped. Over his own damn feet. Hit the floor. Stayed down for a few seconds. And when he looked up, his eyes scanned the bar, scanning for an audience, looking around like a man planning his next move. And then, just before he sat up, he smirked. Because he knew exactly what he was about to do. The moment the footage stopped, Mike leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his smirk growing wider. "So, he said, tilting his head slightly. We still got a problem? The detective exhaled sharply, closed his notebook. And for the first time since Mike had walked in, he didn't have a single damn thing to say. The second the video hit the internet, the narrative started to shift, not because people suddenly cared about the truth, but because they had no choice but to acknowledge it. The headlines that had declared him guilty so damn fast were suddenly rewritten with weak, half-hearted retractions. Mike Tyson cleared of all charges. New evidence shows accusations were false. Tyson speaks out after false allegations. But the problem wasn't that the truth had finally come out. The problem was how quickly the lie had spread before it did. No cameras waited for him when he left the station. No reporters shoved microphones in his face to ask how he felt now that his name had been cleared. Because the world doesn't like to report when they were wrong. They just like to move on, act like they weren't part of the problem in the first place. And that was the realest fight of all. As Mike stepped outside, breathing in the city air, feeling the weight of the last 24 hours finally lift off his shoulders, he knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't be the last time. Not for him. Not for people like him. Because once the world decided what they wanted to believe about you, the truth didn't always matter. And that was the fight he had been battling his entire life. But just like every fight before this, he had won. The tension inside the police station was thick enough to choke on, an almost unbearable pressure hanging in the air, but while the officers were still playing their game, still pretending that they had a solid case, still clinging onto the flimsy accusations they had been fed, Mike Tyson's lawyer sat at the metal table, completely unshaken, his expensive watch catching the dim overhead light as he drummed his fingers against the cold surface, waiting for them to realize they had already lost. Before they even started. "So, let me get this straight," his lawyer finally said, his voice slow, deliberate, slicing through the room like a sharpened blade, each word dragging out the officer's growing discomfort. "You have a man claiming he was knocked unconscious, you have witness statements from people my client has never even spoken to, and yet, you haven't even checked the security footage before bringing him in here like some kind of criminal." The room went completely still. The lead detective, who had walked in with such misplaced confidence, exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his pen, his frustration now clear in the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly, as if he had just realized he had walked into a fight he was never going to win. While the officers exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their chairs, trying to come up with something, anything, that could keep them from looking like complete fools, Mike's lawyer was already miles ahead, pulling out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he placed a call, the sheer authority in his voice making it clear that whatever was about to happen next wasn't up for debate. "Get me the hotel security manager. Now." The officers stiffened slightly, as if the realization of what was coming had finally hit them, but they said nothing, because deep down, they already knew that the truth was about to expose them in the worst way possible. And Mike? Mike just leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, watching them all with the calm of a man who had already seen the end of this fight before it even started. It took less than 30 minutes for the hotel to send over the security footage, 30 minutes in which the officers avoided looking at Mike directly, 30 minutes in which the detective who had been leading the charge stayed completely silent, no longer barking accusations, no longer pretending to have control, no longer wearing that smug expression he had when he first walked in. And then, the screen lit up. And everything they thought they knew collapsed in an instant. The footage started playing, the grainy black and white security camera feed showing exactly what Mike had been saying from the very beginning, the truth. There he was, sitting at the bar, completely relaxed, minding his own business, his hands wrapped around a glass, talking to the bartender in a way that made it clear he wasn't angry, wasn't aggressive, wasn't anything close to the man they had been trying to paint him as. Then the camera shifted, catching Evan Chambers, the so-called victim, the man who had managed to set this entire mess in motion, staggering on his feet, his body swaying dangerously, his hands fumbling for balance on the edge of a nearby table, his movements so sloppy, so obviously intoxicated that even a blind man could have seen what was coming next. And then, the moment that changed everything. Evan didn't get hit. Didn't get shoved. Didn't even get spoken to. Instead, the footage showed him tripping over his own damn feet, his body crashing to the ground, his limbs flailing, his head barely missing the corner of a chair, staying down for several long seconds before he slowly lifted his head, blinking, assessing his surroundings, calculating. And then he smirked. Not in pain. Not in confusion. But in realization. Because that was the exact moment he decided to take his own mistake, his own drunken mess, and turn it into a story that would make him famous overnight. The footage stopped. The lights flickered slightly overhead. And the interrogation room, which had been filled with so much forced authority just minutes ago, was now drowning in the kind of silence that only came when the people who were supposed to be in control realized they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Mike leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table, his expression unreadable behind the weight of what had just been revealed, before finally speaking in a tone so calm, so collected, so utterly unfazed that it only made their failure feel even worse. So, we still got a problem here. The younger officer, who had been visibly uneasy from the start, who had probably been questioning this entire thing in his head but never had the courage to say it out loud, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking anywhere but at the screen, as if he could physically escape the embarrassment sinking in around them all. The lead detective sighed heavily, closing his notebook in a sharp motion, rubbing his temple like he already knew this was going to be a nightmare for him to explain to his superiors. Well, the officer finally muttered, his voice lacking the confidence he had walked in with, it seems there was a misinterpretation of events. Mike smirked. Not because it was funny, but because it was so damn predictable. Misinterpretation, he repeated, shaking his head, his voice dripping with amusement that only made the officers more uncomfortable. Because what else could they say? That they had jumped the gun. That they had let a few false statements outweigh actual evidence. That they had been so eager to take him down that they hadn't even done the bare minimum to check if the story made sense. They weren't going to say any of that. Because the police don't apologize. They just move on like it never happened. By the time Mike walked out of that police station, a free man with no charges, no case, no reason to be there in the first place, the press had already moved on, because clearing his name wasn't nearly as profitable as tearing it down had been. There were no reporters asking how it felt to be falsely accused. No breaking news updates correcting their headlines. No apologies from the media who had thrown him into the fire without a second thought. Because that's the way it worked. And that was the realest fight of all. Evan Chambers never faced any charges. Never faced any consequences. And that was the part that burned the most. Because it wasn't just about one man's lie. It was about how fast people wanted to believe it. Mike Tyson had fought his whole life. But this fight? This one, he won just by standing still. The officers, now completely out of excuses, stood awkwardly in the interrogation room, avoiding eye contact with Mike as if that could erase what had just happened. The lead detective, once so sure of himself, now looked exhausted, like a man who knew he had backed the wrong horse but didn't have the guts to admit it. It seems this was a misunderstanding, he finally muttered, stuffing his notepad into his pocket. Mike smirked. Nah, he said smoothly, standing up from his chair. This was a setup. And y'all played along. The officer exhaled but didn't argue, because deep down, he knew it was true. When Mike stepped outside the station, the city was still moving like nothing had happened, but to him, everything felt different. He had walked in as a suspect, treated like a criminal, put through yet another trial without a courtroom. And yet, as he scanned the street, as he saw the flashing cameras still waiting to capture a scandal, he realized the biggest truth of all: no one was going to care that he was innocent. Because a lie moves faster than the truth ever will. Evan Chambers, the man who had tried to frame him, never faced consequences, never saw handcuffs, never had to explain himself to a room full of cops. He disappeared back into obscurity, forgotten just as quickly as his accusation had spread. Because that's how it always went. Mike wasn't surprised. But he was tired. Tired of having to prove his innocence before anyone even asked if he was guilty. Mike Tyson had been in fights his entire life, in the ring, in the streets, in the media, in rooms like this one, where the only opponent was the way the world saw him. And yet, even when he won, even when the truth came out, even when the entire world saw that he was set up from the start, it didn't feel like a victory. Because the damage was already done. Because the people who wanted to believe the worst about him never needed proof in the first place. And that was the realest fight of all.